Hi, and welcome to Lesson 4 of Module 1. You've now covered 6 of the most common emotional triggers that block the limbic system from opening the toll booth to joyously letting information flow into the frontal cortex. How is that for a quick review of the first lesson? How are you feeling about the techniques you already have in your back pocket to mitigate anxiety, low self-esteem, stubbornness, and the other 3 triggers we've explored? Do you feel a change in the environment just a wisp away? If you've already started using these techniques, how are your students responding to them? Have you noticed that inappropriate behavior is becoming less and less frequent? And if you haven't already noticed this, you're going to. Just take a deep breath because it's going to happen. You've learned so much more than you're aware of yet, and it's all going to take root, and you're going to be amazed at the change in your students' engagement and eagerness to participate. So now we're ready for the last third of the most common emotional triggers that weaken the affective domain, and even more important, strategies you can use to anticipate these triggers and vanquish them. Now come on, you knew I was going to be dramatic again at some point, right? Okay, back to the pleasures of experimenting with techniques in the classroom that are going to change your lives. First, as always, because it's one of the best practices, we're going to do a quick review of the last lesson. Ready? How can impatience be mitigated? By looking at the reality of language learning. If you're saying to yourself, we always think that language learning is linear, but the truth is that the mind needs to process new information in different ways. So if our students knew that in normal circumstances it takes 13,797 hours to learn a home language, they'll be more patient with themselves by the much slower pace of the classroom language. Then you are a rock star, because it's exactly what we sang about in the last lesson. Now, you know we didn't sing much in the last lesson or even at all, but you know what? I love the image, so let's go with it. How can stubbornness disappear by including scaffolds with different learning styles? If you're saying to yourself, students can be very stubborn when their learning style is not addressed, so if we include scaffolds that target different learning styles, they'll be so much happier. Then you are demonstrating a sharp understanding of scaffolds and the positive effects they can have. And how do class meetings bring clarity to confusion? If you're thinking, class meetings are ideal for clarifying unexpected changes, letting students be more empowered in their wishes and comfort level, then you have processed the important subject of class meetings really effectively. And so now we can move on to the last 3 triggers. I mean, really exciting, right? Let's see what they are and how to anticipate and diminish them, all right? Have you done the scaffolding activity for this video? You know by now that it will help you begin processing the information that we're going to talk about so that you'll be able to go through the lessons even more fluidly. So if you haven't done it yet, go ahead, stop the video, take the 5 minutes to do it, and then you know that when you come back, I'll be here waiting for you. All right? Have you been using this technique in your lessons, sharing and co-creating objectives with your students? If you have, you might already see a different attitude in your students' participation in the lessons. Please let me know in the weekly community meetings. It's one of the best parts of offering these modules for me, hearing about the positive changes you're experiencing. The objective for this lesson is to look at the last 3 blocks that may come up for your students when facing new information, and more importantly, to establish tools for fighting these blocks. We're going to look at irritability, apathy, and insecurity. By now, you're familiar with the 9 triggers that can weaken the affective domain. We've explored 6 of them, and most importantly, how to clear those blocks so that information can enter our students' brains fluidly. Now let's look at the last 3. So that you have even more ways of solving student challenges proactively. The next trigger we'll look at that can block learning is irritability. What can cause irritability? Well, a lot of things, obviously, including things that happened before the students entered our classroom. However, some of the things we can do to pacify them and reduce their irritability even before they enter the classroom are what we're going to look at right now. I began teaching as most young teachers do. I stood in front of the classroom and told people things. How does this statement feel to you? Does it ring true at all? Have you ever thought about how you present information? Just wondering, it's not a judgment, but do you talk to your students or do you have a conversation with them? Do the students answer only you, or is there a circular dynamic? In other words, do they address each other also? This all has to do with how you see the learning environment, what your experiences were when you were a student, and the methodology you adopted when you became a teacher. We reflect on these things and we see if it's working for us and for our students. And if necessary, we make changes. It is always the right moment to reflect on what we do. Always. So let's ask a couple of more questions. What is the difference between teaching and learning? I've been thinking about this question for almost as long as I've been a teacher, and that's more than 30 years. I didn't want to just stand in front of my students and tell them things. It didn't feel good when I was young and my teachers did it, so why would I want to perpetuate this dynamic? For the same reason, I really don't like the term teacher, because the connotation is that our job is to tell our students what to learn, expect them to learn it, and judge them on whether they can spit back the information the way we expect it. In other words, this creates a teacher-centered environment. Now, I don't like being told things. I like having the opportunity to process something and decide what part of it I agree with and what part is interesting, what part is necessary, what part I think could be reconsidered. In other words, I like to be involved, not just swallow information whole. If I'm like that, a lot of my students are like that too. So for me, the difference between teaching and learning is that when I walk into a classroom, my expectation is not to teach, but rather to bring materials to the classroom so my students learn. I consider the space in the center of my students' desks the focus, not the front of the classroom. And I work hard to fill that space on their desk with information so that they are learning almost by themselves, with my direction, obviously, and my support. Now, I'm about to get on my soapbox just for a minute because irritability in students is so easily turned around just by thinking, just by reflecting about how we view students as participants in the classroom. This image you see, and we see often in the movies, in series, in advertisement, this is what we're told is the perfect classroom. Students looking at the front of the room, probably at the teacher, and waiting to be called on. And if they can smile while they're doing it, even better. However, what's really going on behind those straight backs and the forced smiles are students who are incredibly practiced at looking interested, but in reality, every year they're more frustrated at being talked to all day and having virtually no autonomy. Students who want to participate more than they're allowed become angry and irritable and quickly shut down or act inappropriately. And where did this begin? Most teachers probably identify the Industrial Revolution as the culprit for this model. It actually started a bit before that. In the 1800s, the Prussian king decided that he needed more malleable soldiers and basically more soldiers. His advisors recommended a different way to use all those taxes that they were demanding. They created schools, and not just for the wealthy, but for all of the citizens. But this was hardly altruistic. There was a catch, obviously. The teaching in the schools were unbelievably authoritative. I mean, most of the original teachers were ex-commanders in the army, and you do not mess with them. So the hordes came to school to learn, but it was very rote learning, virtually only lower level thinking, and the students needed permission to do anything, and they were severely punished if they did it without getting that permission. Think about it. The king didn't want graduates who could think for themselves and question his judgment and decisions. He wanted boys who were used to routines and couldn't put concepts together with any alacrity or accuracy, and obviously who were used to obeying authority. And so yes, this turned out to be perfect for the Industrial Revolution as well, as it engendered the perfect factory workers for assembly lines, who were used to rote work, asking permission for everything, and really didn't have many thoughts in their heads, so didn't have anywhere else to go, basically. And do you think this doesn't happen anymore? What does your classroom look like? And what does your colleague's classroom down the hall look like? David Warlick said this really well. The worst case scenario is that in 10 years from now, we're still graduating kids who are perfectly prepared for the 1950s. He could have actually said for the 1800s and early 1900s, but you get the point, right? So we're going to end the first part of the lesson here because I'd like you to really think about these questions. What does your class look like physically? Where do you stand in the classroom? Where do your students look to find information? Who asks questions and who answers them? And most importantly, who decides if those answers are appropriate or not? How often are the discussions between students, not just between you and the students? And how many learning styles are targeted during a lesson? All of these questions have everything to do with the affective domain, how comfortable and safe and viable students feel in your learning environment, in their learning environment. So go ahead and answer these questions. Think about whether you can tweak or change or adjust a few elements so that your students have more agency, they participate more often, they're more empowered, and have more protagonism. And then save your answers to present in the weekly community meetings, or please go ahead and send them to me. And when you've finished answering them, really reflect on them. I'll be here waiting for you. See you for the second part.